What is Measure 97?
Well, Measure 97 modifies the existing alternative minimum tax that was created by Measure 67 a few years back. It applies only to C corporations, just like the state's corporate income tax. A C corporation is basically a corporation that's owned by shareholders, stockholders, and traded on a public exchange. Most of the big businesses in America are C corporations, not all of them. What Measure 97 would do is that while it keeps the existing Oregon corporate income tax in effect, with its 7.6% of profit tax rate, it would increase the alternative minimum tax from 1/10 of 1% of gross receipts or turnover to 2.5% of gross receipts or turnover, and at the same time eliminate the $100,000 cap on the alternative minimum tax.
Did you have some?
Well, it'll increase gross receipts or sales, and it applies only to the sales of corporations, C corporations, with more than $25 million of sales in Oregon State. I'm a tax specialist, and like most tax specialists, I'd like taxes to do certain things. I'd like the tax to be sufficient. Well, this tax meets that criterion. I want taxes to be fair. I want them to be efficient. I want them to be transparent. I want them to be certain in their application and consequences. This tax is none of those things. It's unlike anything that exists anywhere else in the world, and figuring out exactly how it will play out is extremely difficult. As a tax specialist, I don't like it. Now, the fact of the matter is that what it does is that it will generate a lot more revenue for the state of Oregon. If you think the state of Oregon needs a lot more revenue, this is one way to get it. Secondly, it is a lot like a sales tax. It will behave like a sales tax. Its effects will be like those of a sales tax. And if you think the way the state should get more money, if you think the state needs a lot more of your money, is through a sales tax, then this pretty much meets that criterion.
Would you like to elaborate further on that?
Okay, let me start by saying, by addressing my own prejudices. Okay, I don't like sales taxes. Sales taxes are fundamentally regressive.
Why?
Because generally speaking, the less money people have, the less money a household has, the more of it they spend buying goods and services. For example, if you take the bottom quintile of the population, they spend 90% of all of the income they receive on goods and services. If you take someone in the top quintile, or in fact any of the top 3 quintiles, it's closer to 60%. Consequently, if you face a tax on goods and services, that automatically means that a higher proportion of the tax is going to be paid by people with lower incomes and relatively lower proportion on people with higher incomes. Now, tax specialists can tell you about all kinds of fixes for this problem, but in fact almost nobody has ever employed any of them. Consequently, I don't like sales taxes because they're fundamentally regressive, and unavoidably so. Moreover, the consumption base is fundamentally the same as the income base. So if you're going to tax that base, why not tax income directly? It's a lot easier, and in fact it's universally the case, that income taxes tend to be fairly progressive taxes. And it's easy to adjust them so that they are more or less progressive. Actually, I don't see much evidence that the legislature looked very closely at an income tax or increasing the existing state income tax. The taxes they considered, the ones that I think have a lot of merits, are increasing the, not so much increasing, but shifting the weight use mile tax, which currently only covers commercial vehicles, to all vehicles. That's one source of revenue that the state considered. Another source of revenue the state considered was simply an increase in the gas tax. Third source of revenue that the state considered, and which I would have strongly supported, would be the elimination of the kicker. The kicker on both, we've modified the kicker on the corporate income tax so that it's not automatically returned to the corporations paying the tax, but we continue with the kicker with respect to the personal income tax. And of course, if you like the personal income tax, then we're basically handing money back on the basis of the distribution at which the personal income tax was paid. That's a lot of money. It's especially a lot of money frequently precisely when we need money the most. And the kicker has consistently caused problems for the state's public fisc. I can understand why it was a popular idea. I can understand why during the period when it was adopted, a period in which the state and the U.S. as a whole experienced very rapid inflation, its underlying purpose made a certain amount of sense. But now it's fundamentally a tax on the inability of the state economists to accurately project or predict state revenue. That's a stupid tax.
What was that term you just used, public fisc?
The public fisc are the state's activities with respect to its fundamental financial powers. The power to tax, the power to spend, and the power to borrow.
Okay. So you've outlined some of your objections to Measure 97.
Let me add a couple of more. It's highly non-transparent. I mean, it's basically a sales tax, but you can pretend it's not. You can pretend that it's a corporate income tax. It's not. You can pretend it's a tax on corporations. It's not. Consequently, how it will play out is very non-transparent. Good taxes should be transparent in their effects. Secondly, it's uncertain. One's tax liabilities are extremely uncertain. If you own a home, you know exactly what your property tax is going to be next year. It's going to be equal to a certain amount or somewhat less than that. Can't be anything else. Your tax obligation under Measure 97 as an individual household is extremely unpredictable. Hard to know what it will be next year if we adopt this tax. But even if we know what it's going to be once we've experienced, it's going to be hard to figure out how much you're paying. So if you think taxes ought to be transparent and their consequences fairly certain, this tax isn't either of those things either. Legislative Revenue Office, which I think bends over backwards to be fair and impartial, and the folks at Portland State University in the Department of Economics there who performed the study for the advocates for Measure 97 both fundamentally agree that Measure 97 will, in its ultimate incidence, behave like a sales tax. It is a tax on sales. And consequently, generally speaking, where you tax sales, those taxes tend to be shifted forward to final consumers rather than stick with the employer or pushed backward to some other factor supplier. The Legislative Revenue Office estimates that at least 50% of it, of the $3 billion a year that Measure 97 will collect, will be shifted forward to consumers. I'm sorry. At least 50% of it will be shifted forward to consumers. What happens to the rest? Well, surprisingly, about 700, 800 million of it will be take the form of reduced corporate income tax payments to the federal government. 200 to 300 million will take the form of a reduction in corporate profits. And maybe 100 to 200 million will take the form of reduced wages paid by C Corps and other businesses in Oregon. Now, those are very, very rough estimates. It's hard to know exactly how Measure 97 will play out, as I've said several times. However, both the Legislative Revenue Office and the folks at Portland State agree that this is the most likely scenario. I would point out that they've been much criticized. And I think much of the criticism has been quite unfair. A lot of the supporters of Measure 97 have pulled some theories out of the air, God knows where they come from, about how this is going to, how Measure 97 would in fact play out in practice. There's very little theoretical support for any of those ideas, even less empirical support for them. And indeed, one can make a fairly strong case that if anything, although by no means a dispositive case, a fairly strong case that the Legislative Revenue Office has underestimated the amount of forward shift, in part because a lot of the business segments in which large C Corps operate in Oregon are business segments which tend to be characterized by a high degree of economic concentration. And generally speaking, where you have a high degree of economic concentration, the market leaders are price setters. Okay, when their costs go up, they increase costs. How much will they increase costs? It largely depends upon the amount of competition they face, but they may only partially increase their costs to make up the tax, but they could also increase by more. Furthermore, there's a presumption on the part of the advocates of Measure 97 that what happens when you impose a tax just on industry leaders in a segment is that their behavior will be constrained by the more competitive fringe that doesn't pay the tax. Well, in fact, that's not what economic theory suggests. In a highly concentrated market, what economic theory suggests is that the leader will set the price and the followers will raise to match. Consequently, the amount of shifting that takes place can actually, I'm not going to say will, but it can in theory exceed the tax take going to the state of Oregon. The folks of Oregon will pay the tax without getting the benefit in terms of additional revenue being available to their state government to buy good things. Well, you know, I mean, they say things like, these are big corporations. They charge the same price everywhere in the country. Well, in fact, they don't. They haven't bothered to support that with any evidence whatsoever. whatsoever, except to show a couple of, I think it's Walmart ads in Washington and some other places for the price of Cheerios. Okay, there's little or no evidence that for-profit firms fail to adjust prices to maximize return, to maximize cash flows. And where their costs go up, and this is a measure that would increase their costs, you can anticipate that so will their prices.
Are there particular pages in your report that you'd like to point out and elucidate for us?
Well, there are a couple toward the end that I'd like to point out. What's labeled Figure 8E, and the subsequent figure. And I just want to, I'd just like to bring your attention to these because of some of the claims that have been made about how Measure 97 is redressing a major flaw in Oregon's tax system. Okay. Fundamentally, its advocates have claimed that Oregon is at a real fiscal disadvantage because of a decline in the contribution made by C Corps to state revenue. Well, what 8E shows is a historical breakdown of Oregon revenue by year. Now, if you look at it very closely, and you have to look at it very closely, you can see the contribution made by the corporate income tax in Oregon. It is the light pink, not the dark pink or the medium pink, but the light pink. Now, if you look at this, what you'll say is, I don't see it. And the reason is it has never been that important. At the same time, this next figure shows the distribution of revenue sources over time. And there, the light pink shows up much more clearly. And in fact, it's also clear that as a proportion of the total, although it has never been very much, as a proportion of the total, it's declined. But there is one major reason for this decline. It's much less that C Corps are paying less corporate income taxes, but because we've created, that is the federal government created, in 1986 and expanded in 1984, pass-through provisions so that for a lot of corporations, although not C corporations, the corporate income tax no longer applies to them. Now, as a result of being freed of the corporate income tax at both the federal and state level, their owners probably end up paying more income tax, but the increased income tax almost certainly does not make up for the reduction in the corporate income tax that they've been relieved of. However, these corps are the only ones, the major beneficiaries of federal and consequently state policy that have led to the decline, most of the decline anyway, in the importance of the corporate income tax would not be affected at all by Measure 97. They don't pay corporate income taxes. They wouldn't pay taxes under Measure 97. The folks who continue to pay corporate income taxes are the only ones that are hit by it, C Corps. I've thought a lot about it. Really, my concerns as a tax expert probably aren't that important. The critical issues, I think, are the first two I mentioned. Do you believe that the state and local governments in Oregon have sufficient revenue? And that's a hard question to answer, and it could easily be that they do not. And in a number of areas, I am convinced that they do not. The second part of the question is this a good way to get the money? And I have to reiterate that a lot of people strongly support the idea of a sales tax. And this is basically a sales tax. My objections to a sales tax are pretty idiosyncratic. I happen to think that Oregon actually has one of the very best tax systems in the entire, of any state, local system in the entire United States. My colleagues, when I go to conferences, tend to look at Oregon as a shining example. I'd rather not change that. I'd prefer to incrementally grow revenue in a systematic fashion consistent with our past history, rather than take a giant leap into the dark with a tax like nobody else has ever implemented. A couple of observations. One is that everybody, states included, have limited resources, and they have to make hard choices about their priorities. I'm not at all convinced that Oregon, in the last couple of years, has given enough attention to that particular issue. Secondly, I think that K-12 in Oregon, the support of kindergarten through 12th grade education has been given relatively short shrift by the state legislature over the last 15 years. More so than in many other states. Measures 5, 40, 47, and 50 had the effect of transforming our school finance system from one that was primarily property tax based to one in which, while we have a property tax, it's essentially a statewide property tax. And the decisions about school spending now rest entirely with the legislature and the governor. I think you can make a pretty strong case that the legislature and governor have failed to treat this as a sufficiently high priority. Well, I sympathize with her. It's a lousy tax. The governor has a lot of priorities that call for increased state spending. This is one way for the state to get more money. It's probably not the best way, but perhaps she sees it's the only way. Furthermore, and I have to acknowledge, and anyone should, that what Measure 97 would do is basically change statutes. Consequently, the legislature and the governor are free to amend any portion of it to make it work better or more smoothly or differently in the forthcoming session. None of it is written into the Constitution. And consequently, like, say, Measure 47, which was a mess, and to be perfectly frank, I think nearly every piece of legislation produced by spending legislation produced by initiative as opposed to referendum has been a mess in the entire history of the state. It was a mess. Measure 57 Measure 50, went a long way to fixing some of its worst elements. The difference being that Measure 47 was an initiative put forward by a very ideological and self-interested bunch of folks. You've heard Bill Sizemore. Measure 50 was the legislature's attempt to fix it. And I think they did a pretty good job. Okay, that was then what the legislature proposed as a fix was then referred to the people of Oregon and was widely adopted by the state. In this case, the legislature can act to amend any part of Measure 97 without going to the folks in the state. Although, like every tax measure, one can anticipate that if the legislature passes it, then somebody is going to want to refer it, and it will be referred to the voters. Most Oregonians, I think, are reasonably cautious people. And they'll understand that it's really kind of a dangerous experiment, and perhaps will therefore choose not to support it. Actually, my preferred outcome would be for it to lose, but lose by a relatively small majority, so that it would push the legislature toward dealing with a lot of the issues that it raises. And here I would talk about the opponents of Measure 97. Opponents of Measure 97 imply that it would have disastrous effects that it cannot possibly have. It's not going to put lots and lots of businesses out of business. It's not going to throw lots of Oregonians out of work. Any more than, say, if the state were to adopt a 6% sales tax, which would be something comparable, would have that effect. It will have consequences, but frankly, as an economist trying to measure those effects after the fact, it would be darn hard to see the effect in terms of total number of jobs or business failures. The simple fact of the matter is state taxes are too low to have much effect on the overall economy in a state. They have some, but how they play out probably matters more than their level. Whatever happens, big things that happen in the country as a whole, or even things like the dollar exchange rate, will have more effect on the Oregon economy than Measure 97 will.
Thank you for your time.
A pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for watching.